Now, this next bit is going to be for tuning, and I'm also going to talk about some MSP considerations. Now, these are going to be applicable if you are going to, say, buy a Sky and put it at an MSP as a DR target, or just a replication site, maybe not DR, but in any event, you're going to pay somebody else to host your Sky appliance. Also, if you are an MSP and you are selling our solution as a service, there's a lot of things here you probably know, but I'm going to cover some of the things that generally you've got to stumble a few times and take a couple bruises to learn. So I'm going to share that with you now in hopes that you don't have to go down that same road. So a couple good, we'll call them smart practices, good tips for good performance. Now this applies in your local data center or at the MSP. However, it tends to be more prevalent that these things are not done at MSP, especially if it's an MSP that works with Actifio, if they're a partner of ours, they're probably going to know exactly what needs to be done with your Sky appliance. If you are contacting a MSP and you say, yeah, I want to host an Actifio, and they go to Actifio, what? Warning, still use them, do business with them. However, you're going to want to educate your MSP as to what this appliance really is. Otherwise, they're going to treat it like every other VM. And while it is a VM underneath, as we've just spent the better part of the last hour discussing, what's on top of that VM is anything but a regular virtual machine. This is a virtualized data agility service appliance, not just a couple of NFS shares sitting on the end of a network interface. So a couple tips to make sure that things are going to go well. We're going to want to use multiple disks on the back-end storage. We want to spin as many spindles as we can. Now, obviously, there's a point of diminishing returns. We don't necessarily want 1 gigabyte on each spindle. If it's an older, maybe a little more archaic controller that can only talk to 5 disks at once, then it doesn't make sense for us to spin 7 spindles. However, a lot of the newer controllers, stuff that came out in the last five-ish years, will handle multiple spindles at a time. So if that's the case, if that's the storage you're on, let's leverage that technology and get as many spindles spinning concurrently as possible. We're going to want to use separate RAID 6 groups for our snapshot and dedupe pools. Quite simply, so we can do our snapshot business in one RAID set, and we can do our dedupe business in the other RAID set. We don't have our snap operations waiting on dedupe transactions, and we don't have dedupe waiting for resources to be freed up from snap to continue working. Keep them on 2 completely different RAID sets. They'll both be able to run at a performance level that reflects the resources provision to the VM. Now, if this is a new implementation for you, you don't have storage picked out, you're just really getting your feet wet with Sky, this is our order of storage that we like. We will work with all of these. We'll work with DAS, we'll work with FC, iSCSI, NFS. However, if you're sitting there with a blank slate and a budget, if you can do it, NVMe, directly attached storage, is going to give you your absolute best performance. Do you need it? I'd love to say yes. The answer is no. No, you don't need it. If you're going to do test and dev and you need real high-speed agility, I would look at some of that more performance storage. If we're not going to use NVMe or SSD, I would look at 10,000 RPM spindles. As opposed to 7,200. I would look at those newer controllers that can spin up a dozen spindles at a time. For data protection, you don't need that kind of agility. And we'll do agility in a data protection model. However, using DAS, using NVMe storage, I have restored a 3 terabyte SQL instance from a remote site in under 10 minutes. Yes, under 10 minutes. Now that's probably way more than most people need. And in all honesty, the infrastructure required to do that is probably way more expensive than most people are going to want to spend. So we're still going to do all your data wherever you want it, whenever you want it, using our minimum configuration. So just to touch on disk again, it needs to be 7,200 RPM disk. Again, very highly transactional. We're reading, we're writing, we're paging. We've got all kinds of data moving around. If we're using like really old, slow spinning disk, you're going to feel it. It's going to be a performance hit that you can see reflected in your reports, and you're going to find yourself standing around looking at your watch waiting for things to finish. If we're running 7,200 RPM disk, 10K is even better if you've got them. You will see the best performance. You will see every metric that we advertise be met. Now, no pool should ever live under multiple controllers or switches. Now, I'll unpack that a bit. What I mean is if you have a dedupe pool, that every time we want to talk to that dedupe pool, we need to pass traffic through 4 different switches to check that whole dedupe pool to find a match. Dedupe jobs are going to take days, weeks. A lot of times these interconnect switches, now that is to say the switches that sit in between these physical storage devices, in between your IBM 3700s, your NetApp E-series, they have the ability to talk to the switch that is pushing the data to them. But some of them, depending on their configuration, also have the ability to talk directly to each other. So you've spent all this money, you've got a great 10G environment, you've got the nice cards, you've got the great high speed, high throughput, high concurrency controller, and we make a query, we say, okay, we've got all this great stuff, we're gonna match this dedupe object super fast. We get down to the storage at a speed of 10 gigs. The storage says, oh, I think that lives on my neighbor. It sends the traffic out over 100 megabit interconnect. Obviously, this is not what we want. We just spent all this money, all this time, all this diligence to make sure we had good, fast, high-speed storage, great 10G connections, new multi-concurrency controllers, and now we're using a 100 megabit link from 1992 to match our dedupe hash. So for that reason, let's try to keep each pool under its own controller, under its own switch. Even if it's not the fastest in the world, it's actually better to use a busier single storage array than it is to use 5 unoccupied storage arrays. Simply because if we ask the question, hey, do we have a match for this piece of data? If everything lives under one switch, one controller, we only ask the question once. If that question to be answered needs to communicate across 6 different interconnects, it's do you have it? Do you have it? Do you have it? Do you have it? Again, times 10,000, we're all of a sudden seeing some really terrible performance. When you're reserving your cores, I touched this on a little bit at the beginning. If you are able, reserve those cores across multiple sockets. Again, this comes back to bus lane contention and bus width. If we have 8 requests and we can only make 4 at a time, then we need to make 2 requests of 4 things. But if we split this across 4 sockets, then we make single requests for 2 items to all 4 sockets, and we don't end up with any queuing. All of our requests get serviced immediately. A couple more considerations, and this is a little more MSP oriented. Again, revisiting back on how important it is to make sure that your pools are correctly configured under the right controllers and the right type of network infrastructure. Again, you should not have a pool that we need to talk to 4 switches to access. So spreading pools across multiple controllers will underperform. And it's for that reason I mentioned, instead of asking the question, do you have a match for this 1 time, we ask it 6 times. Now, you're going to see the performance hit here just in a regular dedupe job, where this is really going to, and you might see it and say, oh, well, you know, Dave, it's a little slow, but we got a great deal and we can live with it. Okay, let's run a GC and a sweep. That GC and sweep on a deployment where our dedupe pool is sitting in 5 different storage cabinets is going to take you almost 90 days. Nobody has 90 days for GC. As many of you have maybe encountered, and if you're new to Actifio, I would like to let you know that when we're running a GC or a sweep, we will actually lock the dedupe file system from accepting any more full ingest. So if you want to run incremental jobs against data we've already seen before, apps and hosts that we've already discovered, those will continue to run at a degraded performance rate because that disk pool is busy with the GC and sweep. However, if you needed to onboard a new app or a new host, protect a new vCenter, those jobs will not complete until the GC and sweep is done. Now we get back to our 30, 60, 90-day GC and sweep. Nobody here, myself included, has the kind of wiggle room to delay protection data for an entire quarter. Generally, we get new data, we need to protect it in the first 24 or 48 hours. We definitely cannot wait 90 days. So even if you set it up and it's not great and you think you can live with it, just dump some data into that dedupe pool before it gets important and run a GC and sweep and see how long it's going to take you. The last thing you want is to have been ingesting data for a month, things are going well, your incrementals are good, your dedupe ratios are starting to level out, starting to get some good value, some good dedupe, and then you've got to run a GC, and now you can't ingest any more apps for a month or 2 or 3. So if you're not sure, like I said, if you're on that fence to Dave, the performance kind of stinks, but I think we can live with it. Just give it arbitrary data just to get that dedupe pool filled up, and then run a GC and sweep, see how long it takes. You may be able to live with the prolonged job runtime, but that potential multi-month GC and sweep is probably something you can't live with. And it's obviously better to find that out in the first week than it is to find out a month down the road. And even bigger issue there, if you needed to restore from that, the restore would take forever. So we would have to go to all 5 of these storage cabinets, find all these 4K chunks, reassemble them. We've got to ask the question 10,000 times a minute times 5 different controllers. You are most certainly not going to hit your RPO or RTO in that model. So again, when you're setting these things up, just go ahead and test them. Again, 5 terabytes, 30 days, no fee. Go ahead and fill the dedupe pool. Doesn't matter what you put there, and just run the GC and sweep. Make sure everything's going to run the way that you expect so we can identify any issues before you actually go into production. We can engage our support, our services team. We'll get in there, we'll get everything really working right. And even if things are looking pretty good, but it's, Dave, things aren't working and I don't understand why. And we go in and fix, okay, well now Dave, things are working great and I don't understand why. Go ahead and give us a call. Let us know what you've got. We can access them via WebEx or via our Secure Connect client. And we can take a look and we can kind of explain it to you to enable you to do this successfully going forward. Now, if you really want to go fast, and this is actually a requirement, if you have a bigger than 30 terabyte dedupe pool, you're going to want to put SSDs into your vSphere environment and assign them to your Sky appliance. These SSDs will be used by our dedupe pool as a cache. Specifically, it is a ZIL, Z-I-L. Now that's ZFS intent library or ZFS ingest library, depending on which school you come from, I guess. Now what this will do is all this page caching that I was talking about earlier when we were talking about memory reservation, we'll send that off to the SSD if we do have to cache. Now, obviously, this NVMe storage that we see made available to us today is much, much faster than the spinning disk storage. It's generally more accessible than adding memory. Generally, these nodes are pretty well maxed out. Enterprise memory is expensive, and it's not always a great solution to just continue to add memory. However, a couple of SSDs at enterprise level is a relatively inexpensive investment. And if the performance means that much to you, or if you have a dedupe pool of 30 terabytes or larger, you're really going to want to get these SSDs added. It is a tangible difference in performance. It'll feel like somebody gave you a brand new product once you add these SSDs. And again, this just comes back to, there is some kind of special Actifio stuff that goes on with the dedupe engine, but really underneath it all this is page caching. So everything that you learned in your comp sci classes, everything that you've learned in your careers about page caching, it applies here. Hence the need or want for SSDs in Skies under 30 terabytes and need for SSDs in Skies above 30 terabytes. Now, if you are kind of new to this, data management can be a bit of a tricky business until you get your sea legs. I would recommend always leaving a couple of unassigned disks until you've really got a firm hold on your environment, your deployment. And so what these will do is, let's say you have overconsumed your Snap, you had to onboard some new apps, the boss gave you a whole rec list, so we need to protect these 4 racks out in the data center. And maybe you missized it a little bit, or maybe the SQL DBA, who was supposed to give you the size of the database, gave you old information or left a digit out. Now you've completely, because of this kind of clerical error, we've completely filled our Snap pool, and now we need to restore from dedupe. Well, if there's no room in Snap, we don't have any place to build that restored dedupe image. And this is why I would leave 1 or 2 disks sitting unassigned, but zoned in and made available to the Sky appliance. If we get into this kind of a foible where we've unintentionally filled our snapshot pool, we can just add these disks in, we can get our restore done, and we can reevaluate our storage needs after. However, when you're in that moment, it's, and it always happens, 4:45, Friday afternoon, great plans for the weekend, and oh no, the Oracle admin did not do a local backup, and he's just completely trashed his rack instance, and he needs a restore. Rather than scrambling around trying to find some disk, run down to the data center, get the disk into the shelf, get it zoned in, get everything done, make sure your firmware matches, just get it in there ahead of time. The price of 2 hard disks is pretty negligible. And while you're kind of going through this little bit of a learning curve, if you're transitioning from a product like a backup exec or a Veeam where things work a little bit different, I always just advocate for just leaving a couple extra resources there while you're going through that learning curve, just to make sure that you're safe. Hopefully you'll never ever need to use them, but at that, the Oracle DBA who needs his rack admin restored at 5:45 on a Friday afternoon, those 2 disks are going to feel very, very inexpensive when all you've got to do is add those 2 disks to the snapshot pool, and then you're off for your great weekend's plans. The restore is running, plenty of room to bring it back, and everybody's happy and in good shape. Again, for the price of 2 physical disks, it almost seems silly not to. Thank you for joining us for another YouTube Tech Tip video. If you like the content you're seeing on this channel, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you will be alerted to any future content.